Step into one of the most chilling true crime stories that shook Texas in the mid-1980s. What began as an ordinary night for two young women and their friend ended in a discovery that left both police and investigators stunned. This episode takes you deep inside the events leading up to that night, the moment authorities arrived at the scene, and the investigation that uncovered shocking twists no one could have imagined. We reconstruct the timeline with attention to detail. The final hours before the tragedy, the shocking scene uncovered by police officers, the meticulous work of investigators, and the courtroom battle that followed. Witness how determination, forensic science, and witness testimony brought the case to light and delivered justice for the victims. This documentary-style episode is crafted for true crime enthusiasts who seek more than just headlines. It's about the human stories, the chilling turns, and the fight for truth. Expect atmosphere, suspense, and powerful storytelling, designed to keep you on the edge until the very end. If you're fascinated by real cases, shocking twists, and the perseverance of law enforcement, this is an episode you don't want to miss. Dear viewers, in the next video releases, you will find very intriguing and confusing cases, and in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Austin in the mid-1980s was a city that was changing rapidly. Once a quiet administrative capital of Texas, by this time it had turned into a cultural center with a special atmosphere. Here, student life flourished. The streets were filled with music. On every corner you could meet people discussing politics, sports, or the latest concerts. In the evening, the bars were overflowing with young people. But during the day, order reigned in the quiet neighborhoods. Manicured lawns, neat houses, friendly neighbors. In such conditions, a young woman named Mitzi Johnson Nally grew up and made her plans. Next to her lived another girl, Kelly Farquhar, a little older, more reserved, but no less bright personality. Their lives went in parallel, intertwined in simple human stories: friendship, work, evening conversations, dreams of the future. Mitzi Nally, who was only 21, was born and raised in Texas. As a child, she was known as a smiling and energetic girl who knew how to unite her peers around her. She was not a sports star or an excellent student, but she had a rare quality: ease of communication. She was trusted with secrets. She was invited to different companies. It was interesting to be with her. Teachers noted her activity. The parents of her friends spoke of her as that girl who always says hello and helps. By the time she graduated from school, the character of a person who is cramped in a small town was already forming in her. She was drawn to new acquaintances, to an independent life. When Mitzi moved to Austin, she immediately felt in her place. The city offered opportunities. Here you could find work, communication, entertainment. She rented an apartment in the Sunshine Drive area, one of those neighborhoods that combined silence and youthful spirit. The streets there were safe, neighbors knew each other, and many left their doors unlocked. Mitzi worked, talked with friends, and dated a young man named Ron Ross. Their relationship was developing seriously. Neighbors recalled that they often returned home together, had dinners, received guests. For Mitzi, this was an important stage. She felt that she could build a future next to Ron. Her daily life was typical for a girl of her age, but intense. Workdays, evening meetings, trips to the city center. Austin was famous for its music scene at that time, and Mitzi could often be found at concerts. She loved live music, the atmosphere of clubs, laughter, and noisy companies. Friends said she knew how to create a mood, always found a topic for conversation. Her smile was infectious, and her cheerfulness was sincere. At the same time, Mitzi was not superficial. She knew how to listen and support. She could be serious when required. Kelly Farquhar was different in character, but this was precisely the value of their friendship. 3 years older, she was distinguished from childhood by restraint and prudence. She was also born and raised in Texas, in a family that valued honesty and hard work. At school, she did not strive to be the center of attention, but always remained a reliable person. In her youth, she preferred to read books, help around the house, and make plans for the future. When the time came for adulthood, Kelly chose the path of independence. She moved to Austin to find a job and establish herself in life. Unlike Mitzi, Kelly was in no hurry to enter into personal relationships. She wanted to get on her feet first, to achieve stability. It was important for her to feel confident about the future, and only then think about family. Her colleagues and acquaintances noted her seriousness, ability to see things through to the end, and her friends, her calm sense of humor and loyalty. She was one of those people who can be relied upon in any situation. Their meeting and friendship seemed natural. Two young women living together, similar in spirit but different in temperament. Mitzi brought lightness and energy to their communication, Kelly, stability and prudence. Together they created harmony. Evenings spent in conversation, shopping trips, trips to concerts, or just walks around Austin. For Mitzi, Kelly was an older friend who could be relied upon. For Kelly, Mitzi was a source of positivity and lively energy. The neighborhood on Sunshine Drive, where they spent most of their time, was considered safe and friendly. Small one-story houses, green lawns, neighbors who greeted each other in the morning and knew each other by name. It was a typical American suburb of the mid-'80s, where parents could not worry about their children. In such areas, something serious rarely happened. An atmosphere of trust and safety reigned here. Both girls worked, communicated with colleagues, made plans. They were not famous, did not stand out from the other residents, but this was precisely their strength. They were part of the city, part of its rhythm and its atmosphere. Their life reflected the lives of tens of thousands of young people of that time. There were no boundaries for them. They could laugh, argue, make plans, and believe that everything would work out for them in the future. Neighbors recalled that Mitzi and Kelly's house was always lively. Friends gathered there, music was playing, lights were on in the windows until late. Sometimes they cooked dinner together. Sometimes they just sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, sharing thoughts about the past day. It seemed that life, laughter, and warmth always reigned in this house. It is especially important to note, both girls were far from the world of dangers. They did not seek risky adventures, did not get involved with crime, did not lead a double life. They were the most ordinary representatives of their generation. They worked, built relationships, were friends, looked for their place in the world. In the summer of 1986, both Mitzi and Kelly were in their prime. Youth, energy, plans for the future. Mitzi was happy with her relationship with Ron Ross, believing that a serious continuation awaited them ahead. Kelly was focused on building a career and arranging her life. Their evenings were full of conversations and laughter, and their days were full of worries and affairs. Everything indicated that they had long and eventful years ahead. On the eve of September 13th, 1986, life in Austin was going on as usual. At that time, the city, known for its college atmosphere, music clubs, and warm summer evenings, lived in anticipation of the change of seasons. Autumn in Texas is the time when the heat finally recedes, and the streets gradually fill with freshness, returning energy to the city after the sultry months. On Friday evening, residents rushed to finish their business. Some went to concerts, some to family dinners, and some to visit friends. The usual silence reigned in the residential areas of the city. Illuminated windows, the measured hum of air conditioners, and the occasional sounds of passing cars. For Mitzi Nelly and her close friend Kelly Farquhar, the evening was also calm. They were young, cheerful. Each had plans, hopes, and things ahead that seemed important. The house on Sunshine Drive where they spent time together was quiet and cozy, filled with little things that reflected the girls' characters. Photographs on the walls, books, notes, small decorative details that hinted at their friendship and desire for simple joys in life. Friends and neighbors often dropped by. The atmosphere of the house was truly welcoming. In the evening, they did not have large gatherings. It was more of an ordinary day, filled with conversations and leisurely rest. Kelly, more practical and calm, liked to spend time at home. Mitzi, sociable and energetic, often shared plans, news, and discussed upcoming affairs with her. That evening, they also met Ron Ross, Mitzi's boyfriend. The three sat together, talked, and laughed. None of them guessed that this ordinary evening would be the last for the two young women. Closer to night, the area they were in sank into its usual calm. The houses were plunged into darkness. The streets were illuminated by rare street lamps, and outside the window one could only hear the chirping of insects. For the neighbors, it was an ordinary night. People were getting ready for bed, not expecting anything unusual. It was against the backdrop of this deceptive silence that events began to unfold that would later shake the entire city. Around midnight, sounds were heard in the area that disturbed the usual calm. No one could immediately understand what exactly was happening. In one of the neighboring houses, people became wary. A strange noise was heard in the silence, similar to a quarrel or a scuffle, but many preferred not to pay attention to it, deciding that these were ordinary household sounds coming through the thin walls of houses. However, after a while the tension began to mount. The noise intensified, and soon muffled screams burst out from the house on Sunshine Drive. Those who were closest recall that the screams had the character of a desperate call for help, but they were short, interrupted, as if they were being muffled or cut off. One of the neighbors later reported hearing a woman's voice screaming something unintelligible, but with such force that it became clear that something terrible was happening. Soon after, another sound was heard in the silence, a heavy blow, then a booming thud. After that, the house was again filled with an uneasy silence. The minutes dragged on slowly. The neighbors who were in their homes were torn between doubts. Should they intervene? Should they call the police? At that time in America, there was no habit of reacting instantly to any noise. Many were afraid of making a mistake or seeming panicky. But the anxiety was growing. The decisive moment came when one of the neighbors noticed uncharacteristic activity. Shadows were flickering in the window, as if someone was moving inside too quickly and chaotically. Then the local dispatch center received a call. The caller, incoherently explaining the situation, spoke of screams and strange sounds in the house on Sunshine Drive. The dispatcher recorded the call and sent the nearest patrol to the scene. The time between the call and the arrival of the police seemed like an eternity. Neighbors looked out of their windows. Someone went out onto the porch, trying to see what was happening, but the darkness of the night hid the details. Soon a patrol car drove out onto the street. Red and blue lights pierced the darkness, and a tense silence fell over the area as people realized something serious had happened. The first police officers to arrive at the scene immediately felt uneasy. As they approached the house, they noticed no movement outside, but there was a tension in the air, as if the house itself was keeping a terrible secret. The porch was silent, the door was closed, and the lights inside were off. The officers knocked, then shouted loudly, introducing themselves and demanding that the door be opened. There was no answer. Deciding to act, they went inside. The scene they saw was the first alarm signal. The house was in chaos. There were signs of disorder, discarded items, overturned furniture. The officers looked at each other. It was clear that something extremely serious had happened. As they walked further, they noticed signs of a struggle that led deeper into the house. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the walls had absorbed the tension of the last few hours. The officers moved carefully, examining each room until they finally reached the bedroom. There, the most horrific discovery of the night awaited them. It was in this room that the police first encountered the terrible truth. The bodies of two young women, Mitzi Nally and Kelly Farquhar, lay on the floor. The scene was so terrible that even experienced officers later admitted that such things cannot be erased from memory. Medics were immediately called to the scene, but in the first seconds it became clear that it was impossible to help the girls. Their lives had been tragically cut short. The only sounds in the house were the heavy breathing of the police and the quick steps of the paramedics who arrived. But the doctors only stated what was already obvious. Both girls were dead. At that moment, the night in Austin changed for everyone who lived on Sunshine Drive. The neighborhood, accustomed to silence and safety, suddenly found itself in the center of a terrible tragedy. For neighbors, for friends, for relatives of Mitzi and Kelly, life was divided into before and after. The first hours after the bodies are discovered are always the most difficult for the investigation. The house was oppressively quiet, broken only by the whispers of the forensic experts recording the situation. Nellie and her friend's house turned into a closed crime scene, where every little detail could be decisive. Police and forensic experts were working inside, and neighbors were crowding outside, trying to understand what had happened in this quiet Austin neighborhood. The police recorded everything: the position of the bodies, signs of a struggle, shoe prints, stains on the carpet and walls. The picture was terrifying, A fierce fight was going on in the house. The girls resisted with all their might, and this was evident from the disorder in the room. Scattered objects, overturned chairs, torn curtains. Everything indicated that they had fought to the last. And it was in this setting that the investigators found their first unexpected detail. In the next room, seriously injured but alive, was a young man. Ron Ross, Mitzi's boyfriend. His condition was critical. His breathing was ragged, but he still survived. An ambulance rushed him to the hospital, and the police knew that if he survived, his testimony would be the key to solving the mystery. While doctors fought to save Ross's life, the bodies of Mitzi and Kelly were taken to the morgue for forensic examination. It was here that the experts were supposed to shed light on what happened that night. Forensic examination in such cases is always the moment of truth. The autopsy of the bodies of Mitzi Nally and Kelly Farquhar became the key to understanding what exactly happened that fateful night. The experts carefully recorded every detail, knowing that their conclusions would later be taken apart in court literally word for word. The first thing that caught the eye was the multiple stab wounds. Mitzi's body had more than a dozen blows, some of which were in the chest area. Experts found that most of them were delivered in a short period of time, indicating a swift, furious attack. But one detail was especially important. The blows were delivered at different angles, indicating the attacker's movements were chaotic. He did not act like a cold-blooded killer, but like a person in a state of affect or under the influence of substances. Kelly's picture looked similar, several deep wounds, one of which turned out to be fatal. But she also had signs of self-defense, characteristic cuts on her arms, left as a result of attempts to fight off the blows. This proved that she resisted to the last. Such details were invaluable for the investigation. They showed that the girls were struggling, that everything happened quickly and unexpectedly. Another important aspect is the time of death. Experts determined that both victims died at roughly the same time, within 15 minutes of each other. This meant that the attack was almost simultaneous, and the perpetrator acted quickly, leaving the victims no chance to escape. The nature of the blows indicated that the attacker acted with rage and determination. The medical examiner recorded that the blows were aimed at vital areas, indicating the intent to kill, not just scare. This became an important clue for the investigation. The nature of the wounds often speaks to the psychology of the criminal. This was not a cold-blooded hired killer, but a person overcome by strong emotions. The question arose: were these emotions connected with the victims themselves? Did he know them personally? Or was it blind aggression that spilled out on the night of the tragedy? Meanwhile, the police methodically worked through the girls' circle. Investigators talked to neighbors, friends, colleagues. It turned out that Mitzi and Kelly led an ordinary life. Work, meetings with friends, rare parties. No one had serious conflicts. Only one important detail was revealed. That evening, the girls were not going anywhere. They stayed at home, planning to spend a quiet night. So, someone came to them themselves. At this time, the first cautious news began to arrive from the hospital. Ron Ross, despite serious injuries, survived. His condition remained serious, but doctors gave hope that he would be able to testify. For the investigation, this was a real breakthrough. A living witness could tell more than dozens of circumstantial evidence. And indeed, a few days later, when Ross was able to speak for the first time, he gave his first testimony. His voice was weak, his speech was incoherent, but he reported the main thing. A man he recognized broke into the house. This name became a turning point in the investigation: Jonathan Wayne Nobles. This was a surprise for the investigation. Nobles was known to the police, but not as a cold-blooded criminal. He was known as a former electrician, a man who had already had problems with the law, but was released on parole. He had problems with drugs, an unstable life, but no one expected that he was capable of such a thing. Investigators began to check his alibi, but it turned out to be shaky. Nobles was confused in his testimony, said that he was alone on the night of the crime, and could not confirm his words. Moreover, fresh wounds were recorded on his body, cuts on his hands and abrasions, which he explained as an accident. For the police, this looked suspicious. When he was called in for the first interrogation, he tried to act confident. But experienced detectives knew. Confidence can be a mask. During the conversation, Nobles began to get confused in details, change the sequence of events, make slips of the tongue. His contradictions were recorded by stenographers and compared with Ross's testimony. Gradually, a picture emerged. It was he who was in the house that night. The key moment was the conclusion of the forensic experts. Fingerprints were found at the crime scene that matched his. Moreover, traces of blood in the house partly belonged to Nobles himself. The genetic examination left no doubt. This meant that he was not only at the scene of the crime, but also received injuries during the fight. The investigators understood that they had enough evidence to bring charges, but they wanted to see it through to the end, to get a confession. The pressure was increased at the next interrogation. The detectives methodically laid out the facts: fingerprints, traces of blood, the testimony of a surviving witness. It all fell on Nobles like an avalanche. His previous confidence disappeared. He began to fidget with his hands, and give inappropriate answers. It was at this moment that it became clear. The case was approaching a denouement. That evening, after many hours of interrogation, Nobles was officially arrested. He was taken to the station, where he was charged with double murder and attempted murder. For the city of Austin, this was a shock. Young women whose lives were just beginning were victims of a brutal attack. But for the police, it was a matter of honor. They managed to go from chaos at the crime scene to the arrest of a suspect, collecting a solid chain of evidence. The investigation was over. Ahead was the trial, a process that was supposed to put a final end to this story. But even then, everyone understood. Whatever the verdict, the life of the city had changed forever. The trial of Jonathan Wayne Nobles was one of the most high-profile events of the second half of the 1980s for Austin. The city, shocked by the double murder of Mitzi Nally and Kelly Farquhar, was now living in anticipation of the trial. Newspapers published daily reports on the preparations, discussed possible lines of defense, and predicted what the jury's verdict would be. For many residents, this was not just a criminal case. It became a symbol of the clash of ordinary, peaceful life with the senseless cruelty that burst into the homes of ordinary people. The courtroom itself was overcrowded in the first days of the trial. Relatives of the victims sat in the front rows. Next to them were the girls' friends, neighbors, and classmates. On the other side was Noble's own family, looking confused and broken. There was not enough space. Journalists, law students, and random residents came, wanting to see with their own eyes how the court dispensed justice. The atmosphere was tense, almost tangible. Every look, every movement of the defendant was recorded by dozens of eyes. In the dock, Nobles behaved strangely. Sometimes he looked at the floor without raising his eyes, and sometimes, on the contrary, he looked around the room with an expression that some called indifferent and others defiant. His appearance contrasted with the photographs of past years. Almost nothing remained of the energetic young electrician. In front of the jury sat a man whose eyes combined fatigue, internal tension, and something alarming that did not fit into the usual ideas of remorse. The prosecution immediately outlined its position. The prosecutor's opening statement was structured as a dramatic account of the events of that night. He described in detail the lives of Mitzi and Kelly, emphasizing that we are talking about young women whose lives were tragically interrupted. The prosecution put forward the thesis. Nobles acted deliberately and with particular cruelty, and for this he should suffer the highest measure of punishment. The defense tried to paint a different picture. The lawyers insisted that their client was addicted to drugs and alcohol, was in an altered state of consciousness, and had no control over his actions. In their version, Nobles was not a cold-blooded killer, but a man whose personal demons drove him to commit a crime. The defense line was built on an attempt to evoke sympathy from the jury. They said that the defendant was not so much a monster as a victim of his own addiction. The subsequent hearings turned into a tense series of witness interviews. The first to speak was the police officer who arrived at the crime scene that night. His story was laconic, but every word made a strong impression. He described how he entered the house, what traces he saw, how he discovered the girls' bodies. The room was silent, broken only by the creaking of chairs. The jurors listened attentively, writing down individual details. Then the court heard the medical examiner's reports. One of the doctors described in detail exactly what wounds the victims had sustained and how they had become fatal. He spoke in a dry, professional language, but that was precisely what enhanced the effect. There was no emotion in his words, only facts. The jurors heard numbers, angles, descriptions of the wound locations, and each of them had a terrible picture in their heads. These words deprived the defense of the opportunity to present what had happened as an accidental tragedy. The key moment in the trial was the testimony of Ron Ross, the only survivor that night. He entered the courtroom slowly, visibly nervous. His face reflected difficult memories that are impossible to shake. He described how he ended up in the house with the girls, how the attack suddenly began, how he tried to stop the attacker, and how he miraculously survived after receiving several blows. His voice trembled, but every word was measured. He was not simply describing the events, he was reliving them in front of the jury. When the prosecutor asked who exactly had attacked them, Ron didn't hesitate. He looked straight at Nobles and said his name firmly. At that moment, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. The defendant flinched slightly, but said nothing. For the jury, this was a turning point. Now the testimony of a surviving eyewitness was supported by physical evidence, Nobles' blood found at the crime scene and the matching results of the examination. The defense tried to challenge the testimony, pointing out the possible stress of the witness and the fact that his memories could be distorted. But their arguments looked weak. Too much evidence matched. Forensic examination, signs of a struggle, genetic material found in the house. All this added up to a consistent picture. Particular attention was drawn to the questioning of Nobles himself. In court, he agreed to answer questions, but he did so reluctantly. Sometimes he got confused over small details. Sometimes he answered sharply, as if irritated. The defense tried to portray him as a broken man addicted to drugs, but the prosecutor skillfully unsettled him, demonstrating to the jury that before them was not only an addict, but also a person capable of deliberate actions. The trial lasted several weeks, and with each session, it became increasingly clear that the outcome of the case was practically a foregone conclusion. The press in Austin wrote about the trial of darkness, emphasizing the symbolic significance of what was happening. People came to the courtroom as if to a performance, but it was a performance in which human life and justice for two young women were at stake. The closing arguments of the parties became the climax. In his closing argument, the prosecutor spoke not only about the facts, but also about the human dimension of the crime. He reminded the jury that Mitzi and Kelly were real people with their own dreams and plans, and that they would never return home again. His voice was harsh, but there was a genuine emotion in it that touched many in the room. The defense attorney, in turn, asked the jury not to deprive his client of the right to life. He spoke of Nobles' difficult fate, of his addiction, of the possibility of rehabilitation. He tried to evoke sympathy, appealed to humanity. But for many listeners, these words sounded like a weak attempt to deflect responsibility. When the jury retired to deliberate, a painful pause reigned in the room. Relatives of the victims held hands, many cried. The hours dragged on endlessly, and then finally the jurors returned. Their faces were serious, focused. The verdict was clear and unwavering. Jonathan Wayne Nobles was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury unanimously upheld the charge. The judge, relying on the unanimous verdict of the jury, sentenced Jonathan Wayne Nobles to death, and the courtroom erupted in sobs. Mitzi and Kelly's relatives hugged, not in relief that their daughters would never be brought back, but in the sense that justice had been done. Nobles' face showed neither surprise nor remorse as the verdict was read. He merely lowered his head slightly, as if he knew there could be no other outcome. Thus ended one of the most high-profile trials in Austin history. The verdict closed the case, but left an indelible mark on the city.